Namaskar, Adab, good afternoon. Flow welcomes President Ujjwala Singhania, past presidents of Flow, governing body members, all our guest speakers, moderator, Flow members, and the many audiences who have logged in for the roundtable session, Decoding India's Economic Challenge, the Future for Industry Beyond the Pandemic. This is the first time that Flow is conducting an industry-specific roundtable meeting with such exemplary leaders to collectively deliberate on issues that affect all our businesses. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for accepting our invitation and supporting us. We know that today's women are redesigning world economy with their very noticeable contributions. Like Ujjwala always mentions, Flow believes that women-led development will definitely pave the way for self-reliant India. In the last 15 months, both people and economy have been severely challenged due to the pandemic, which has not only impacted economic activity, but also slowed the economy. Many Indian businesses, including many MSMEs, are facing multi-level challenges that has sent them into a degrowth mode. Though government has stepped in bits and pieces, unfortunately, it's not substantial enough, and recovery is still muted, slow, and uncertain. The industry community today feels the need for larger support and timely action from the government. A number of questions are plaguing our minds. Will the government support industry to avoid further derailing of the economy? What do we as industry leaders need for our fraternity? What priority actions by both industry and government are needed to bring economy back on track, to become a robust economy again? What new policy changes are needed? What does the future hold for us? And many such questions plaguing us. It may be years before we comprehend the long-term ramifications of COVID on our society and businesses. Yet, despite all odds, we are looking forward to rise and revive with the spirit that together we can and we will. That's the Indian survival spirit that I think all of us are proud of. Our guests will deliberate on this and much more. Audience, a little suggestion to you. If you have any suggestions for stimulus that and recommendations to government, please put it in the chat box. Our team will gather and collate them. We will collate it along with our document. You may also put in your questions. However, we'll be happy to take them only if time permits. I'd like to acknowledge the industry team of Jyotsna Angara, Ajita Yogesh, Ruchika Gupta, Kamini Saraf for conceptualizing and all the efforts to execute this event. Thank you, Ujjwala, for your constant encouragement. I invite governing body members, Ruchika Gupta and Ajita, to introduce our guest speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Jyotsna. It's indeed an honor to introduce such exemplary members. My first panelist for the evening today, Ms. Preetha Reddy, Executive Vice Chairman, Apollo Hospitals Group, plays a very important role in making high-quality healthcare available to all for the betterment of India. The company makes facilities available across the nation. She is one of the most rewarded individuals who successfully brought about notable changes and standardized quality healthcare in the medical sector. Preetha ji has emerged as a prompt activist in rehabilitation programs for areas affected by natural calamities. Flo salutes you for your endeavor, ma'am. Apollo Hospitals has successfully delivered outstanding medical care during the COVID-19 outbreak, for which she was awarded the Economic Times Businesswoman of the Year Award in 2021. She has also been conferred with the Healthcare Personality of the Year Award by FICCI for her far-sighted vision, notable contributions to the fields of healthcare and social sciences. A very warm welcome, ma'am. Flo is honored to have you with us today. Thank you. Shri Naveen Munjal, Managing Director of Hero Electric Vehicles Private Limited, a part of the Hero Eco Group. has made the brand into a leading manufacturer and a market leader in the electrical vehicles two-wheeler market in India. At an international level, Hero Electric launched A2B, a premium brand of electrical bicycles, which is widely considered one of the pioneers in the premium EV industry globally. He's on the board of LIVA, Light Electric Vehicle Association USA, and has been instrumental in founding SMEV, Society of Manufacturers of Electric Vehicles, the only representative body of the Indian electric vehicle industry in India, and heads it as its president. Thank you, sir. He's an advocate on climate change and zero emission mobility and has lectured on this extensively at various global forums and conferences. In the past, he's been on the board of EO, New Delhi chapter, and is currently on the board of Bpo Delhi chapter. Mr. Munjal is an avid photography. His passion lies with street photography, an advanced open water diver, and adventure sports enthusiast. Flo is humbled to have you with us, sir, today, and we are looking forward to having your thoughts. Thank you. My next panelist for the evening, the very esteemed Shri Sanjeev Samyar, economist, urban theorist, and best-selling author. He dons many hats. He is the principal economic advisor to the Ministry of Finance, Government of India, co-chairman of the G20 Framework Working Group. He has been one of the main architects of the Global Action Plan, which was imposed to fight the COVID-19 pandemic. He has spent over 2 decades in the financial sector and was the global strategist and managing director at Deutsche Bank. He is widely recognized for applying the chaos theory and complex adaptive systems framework to economic and urban issues. He has been a visiting scholar at Oxford University, a adjunct fellow at the Institute of Policy Studies, Singapore, a senior fellow at Worldwide Fund for Nature, and an honorary professor at JNU Delhi. Some of his best-selling books include Land of Seven Rivers, The Indian Renaissance, India in the Age of Ideas, and The Ocean of Churn. I would just like to add here, sir, we keep reading about your thoughts, and honestly, India is honored to have somebody like you as their principal advisor. A very warm welcome, Mr. Samyar. Over to you, Ajita.
Thank you, Ruchika. Our next speaker for the day would be Kaushik Shaparia. Kaushik Shaparia is the Chief Executive Officer of Deutsche Bank in India and a member of its Asia Pacific Executive Committee. Kaushik has 36 years of extensive banking experience across transaction banking, global markets, businesses, debt capital markets, and client coverage, including several regional and global roles. Kaushik was responsible for greater alignment across the bank's corporate coverage network globally. In his previous roles across trade finance and cash management, he was also responsible for building the bank's strong transaction banking franchise. Welcome, sir. It's an honor to have you here with us today. Our next speaker of the day would be Charu Malhotra. She's a leading educationist and well-respected learning and development professional with more than 20 years of experience. She has worked with more than 15 state governments on projects in education, gender, technology, and in CSR programs, and has served on important panels and committees of government in India. She has developed competency-based curriculum and assessments. She specializes in early child education and gender-based development programs, working closely with the Ministry of Women and Child Development on policy reforms. The moderator for today's session is Lata Venkatesh. Lata Venkatesh began her career in CNBC TV 18 as chief of the Mumbai News Bureau. Over the years, she has come to be recognized as one of the keenest watchers of the Reserve Bank of India and a respected commentator on banking sector's issue, money markets, and macroeconomic trends. She has been a business journalist for years and has specialized in covering all markets. She has also had stints in all major streams of media, having worked in Economic Times and Dow Jones Newswires for 5 years each. I now invite Ms. Ujjwala Singhania, National President Flo, to welcome the guests and start the event today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A very good afternoon and namaste. A special and warm welcome to all our esteemed leaders. Thank you for being here with us today. It is my belief that women economic participation, along with ownership and control of productive assets, will speed up development for India. With our 18 chapters and over 8,000 members, it is my commitment to build an entrepreneurial driven economy and research in India where women play a major role in the development of the country. Initiatives like entrepreneurship development, building women-centric startup ecosystem, and others have been undertaken by Flow to ensure self-reliance amongst women who are large contributors to MSME sector. Noteworthy among various initiatives is the first Flow Industrial Park in Hyderabad, which we hope to inaugurate very soon. The industrial park has 25 manufacturing units that are 100% women-owned and run, with an investment of over 250 crores. It will generate 1,800 employment. Very soon, Flow will also have 30 women certified by Ministry of Corporate Affairs as independent board directors to be taken on various company boards. We will also list them on our Flow website. I believe in the industry participation of women will bring in much needed social change for India. 2020 was a dark year for us, with people, businesses, and economy severely challenged. Sadly, many small and large industries have shut down. Job losses have been at highest ever, and the economy continues to face downturn. Our deliberation today with you all thought leaders is to share opinions and suggestions on what support does the government require from industry. Let us deliberate on what policy changes are needed, keeping the current situation in mind. Will we soon become a thriving economy again, or continue to face challenges that threaten to derail the effort to build the economy? We plan to submit the key points from outcome of our discussion today to Honorable Minister of Industry and Commerce, Shri Piyush Goyalji, and to Honorable Minister of MSME, Shri Nitin Gadkariji. With women-owned businesses largely in the MSME sector, we have scheduled a session focusing on MSME sector to address the challenges and untapped opportunities in the sector. We have also planned a one-day conference, the Flow Industry Conclave, which is a confluence of great minds and thought leaders from the industry. Ladies and gentlemen, I take this opportunity to thank all of you again to be part of this initiative. And as a token of our appreciation, we would like to present each of you a green certificate where we plant trees in your name. I request the IT team to please present them virtually. I now invite Lata Venkatesh to take the next session forward. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Flo, do I call you? I think you have earned yourselves an ESG certificate for sure. The ESG investors will be very happy to invest in the FICCI Ladies organization for your very green certificates. Thank you very much for having me to moderate this panel. Well, I must say it's a very representative set of speakers. We have Naveen Munjal, who represents the consumer sector and entrepreneurship itself at its best, women entrepreneurship at its best, and the most important sector which needs entrepreneurship, Preetha Reddy in hospitals. And then we have a banker with us, Kaushik Shaparia, and we have someone who would normally have been, after discussing everything, you have the CSR discussion. But today, very prominently, we have Charu Malhotra, who is an educationist, sharing the panel quite clearly, accepting that, we have to look at these social needs more importantly and as mainstream and not as also ran when we plan policies, holistic policies. And of course, Sanjeev Samyar, I can't ask for a better representative because Sanjeev Samyar, I think to my knowledge, is the only person who has 20 years in industry and has then been in government for several years now. We've had very few such instances in policy making. People from industry have invited to head a committee or two, but making policy, I think, is it's very rare that a person with so much experience in industry is involved in policy making. That clearly makes him best placed to understand problems of industry and as well recommend solutions to the government. Sanjeev Samyar, thank you very much for joining in this discussion. The topic we have to discuss is the several challenges and uncertainties thrown by the waves of COVID. What are the problems that industry faces? It's natural for industry to run to the government for help. And what does the government have in its mind in terms of their interpretation of problems and solutions as they see it? So that's really my first question to you, Sanjeev Samyar. Many listed companies are reporting actually good results, both for FY21 and for FY22, the current year. The Nifty EPS is expected to grow by 38%, 38% profit growth in what should have been a difficult year with two waves of COVID already behind us. So some part of India is done very well, and yet we know that large segments have been shut down or locked down compulsorily for several months of the last 12 months. So, what is your estimate of who is hurting? Clearly, the formal sector has actually done better. So who, according to the government, is most hurt? Sanjeev.
So I think there's obviously, when you are in lockdown, and particularly the second wave lockdown, certain kinds of sectors like related to travel, tourism, retail, anything that required face-to-face interaction, that was hurt. Overall system was not shut down as happened in the first round. But I think the first thing, as far as the government is concerned, the first priority has got to be to unlock the whole thing, because the game does not even start unless you have unlocked most of these things, because the guys who are hurting are shut down because of health reasons, not economic reasons. So I think getting the vaccination drive going as strongly as possible is surely priority number one. And you've seen that in the last couple of weeks, we are vaccinating almost between 4 and 6 million a day. We've even had a spike to 8, but by and large, we are in the 4 to 6 million range, which is a good clip if we keep it going. I think that's good, but we need to keep that momentum there. The second thing is that irrespective of how fast cases have come down, we need to continue to do surveillance and testing so that we have good warning very early on if a third wave pops up, and we can localize it rather than it spread through the country. So I think the first thing I want to place on the table is that responding quickly to a third wave and making sure the vaccination keeps happening is key, rather than wasting our time trying to model when a third wave will come, because nobody really knows. That's one. The second thing from an economic perspective is people have almost forgotten that we did have a very expansionary budget that we announced in February, and that most of that financial year is still not happened. So we need to get out there and do all the things which I think most of you will have agreed were good things. So we need to get out there, spend the money on building the infrastructure, do all the other good stuff that everybody agreed was needed to be done. So implement budget February 2021 and do it properly. Third, again, parallel to the idea of surveillance for the health, we need to do surveillance on the economic front. Again, as you know, I'm not a big votary for making predictions based on models. What we need to do is to watch what the real data says. And here, the key to doing sort of new things, i.e. beyond what is there in the budget, is to look at what actually happens. And here, if you give me a few seconds, I'll explain there are three possible routes that we could go into, and they all require somewhat different macroeconomic responses. So we need to be sure which one of these three. One possible outcome is that we open everything up, we get a bit of a bounce from revenge buying and so on, but then it all peters off. In which case, our bias of policy will have to be pro-growth. Yeah, we don't have to worry about other things, go for growth. The second possible outcome is that, in fact, many things like exports are already doing very well, FDI is doing very well, consumers come back very strongly, and in that context, inflation will become the issue. And by the way, inflation is not an India problem. You're seeing it popping up everywhere in the world. Some of it may be due to fuel prices, but if there is genuine return of demand and momentum, then it will begin to feed through into the second and third round. In which case, the mix that we have to put in there has to change a little bit towards inflation control. Then there is a third possibility, which is what you alluded to in your question, that the economy comes back reasonably and the formal sector particularly does well. There may even be inflation in the system. But there are certain parts of the economy that are suffering. Now, these could be verticals, i.e. sectors, tourism, health, whatever, not health, but travel, retail, etc. Or they could be horizontals, which could be MSMEs, a particular part of the country which is affected or whatever. Whatever it is, in that environment, simply pumping up overall macro demand is not good enough because, in fact, you may be worsening the inflation problem, but on the other hand, not helping the guys who need the help. In that context, we maintain more or less the budget momentum as the baseline, but then we target those specific sectors. Now, the problem is, I do not know ex ante which of these three paths will come, but we will get a fairly good feel of this, I think, within 5 or 6 weeks. So we need to watch the data very, very closely. And once we have a general idea of which of these paths we are going down, then the second round and third round policies will have to play down that. But meanwhile, what we did as a precaution, we did just a week ago put through all those a whole bunch of guarantees for on the credit side to make sure that at least credit flow for the most needy still flows. Back to you.
Well, that's a very comprehensive take on where the government is coming from, or where you see the hurt in the economy and where things are likely to be. But Sanjeev, just one more question before I go to the others. You alluded in passing to inflation. Until now, it was not an issue. Even the MPC could say that it could see through it. But the latest number, the May number, was a bit of a shocker. And the June number, many believe, could be 7%. So do you think now that this abundant liquidity that was available may now not be something both government and economy can bank on?
So I think here you have to take the international context into account. Inflation has popped up in many, many places. And some of it may be, year-on-year effects of a disrupted year. So we need to be very careful not to overreact and kill off incipient growth just because inflation is popping up in various ways. And particularly there is the oil price effect which spikes up, which will feed through if there is genuine demand growth, but it will not feed through so much and will peter out if it is especially since, some of this oil price is also happening because OPEC Plus is having debate, but eventually even they will sort it out. So I think we need to not get thrown off by a spike in oil prices, because that, I know everybody debates that, but clearly that is something we need to be careful not to do. What we are really interested in is the wider demand-driven inflation, which feeds through to everything else. And that is where I would argue that we can't really predict it. But should that happen, i.e. generalized demand-driven inflation begins coming back, then we'll have to take account of it. But on the other hand, it will mean that we have solved other problems relating to growth, i.e. the situation where that will happen is likely to be a situation where demand has come back reasonably well. So in which case, we will have solved that set of problems, but we'll have a new set of problems to solve. But then that requires us, however, to be agile rather than to commit ourselves in one direction. That's why I right up front said, we need to keep our eyes open to what is happening, not what our models are telling us.
Okay, we can scratch this point a little further, but maybe later on in time, because there is a worry with some economists that what you're saying is that if inflation is going up, then it also means that a part of the growth problem has been resolved. That is why there is demand-led inflation. But there are some who believe that if inflation continues at 7% for a few months, then it has a tendency to stick on. It becomes
the point
into inflation.
Neither they nor I can predict this.
Yes.
And a lot of it depends on what is happening worldwide. So the point I'm making to you is there are times where you've got to have look, we've got things to do. It's not like the government doesn't have things to do. We've got the budget to implement. We've got the vaccination to implement. We've got a whole bunch of supply side measures that we always have, we need to do. So we've got plenty to do. So keep doing the good things, and then depending on which particular path we're going down, respond to it. Do not try to solve a problem that does not appear, because you might be solving the wrong problem.
Fair enough. It may be premature to discuss, and I hope that is the situation. Let me now come to the consumption sector, and I think Mr. Naveen Munjal represents that very ably. Mr. Munjal, can you give us an idea of how consumption is panning out? And I'll tell you one problem that hurt me. Let me take the Hero Moto numbers, June numbers. It was 4.69 lakhs, which was much better than the analyst forecast of about 4.2 lakh. So actually it was a good number and definitely much better than May. But if you look 2 Junes away, not at last June, because that was obviously a lockdown situation. In June of 2019, Hero Moto had sold 6.2 lakh bikes. And in June of 2018, they had sold over 7 lakh bikes. So, there is a slowdown over here pre-COVID, which perhaps, BS4 and all that, you could give those arguments. But there is a worry both in the mass two-wheeler makers and other consumer durable makers like air conditioners, who believe that, the middle class is not growing, that there is a consumption problem. You tell us from your angle, what is the consumption situation? Are you worrying that it was already slowing, or it was okay, but COVID has created some permanent hurt?
Thank you, Lata. A very valid question. It's a very valid point. Now, let me address it from multiple different angles. One is, of course, when you look at the automotive sector had been slowing down a little bit, and coming COVID didn't really help in a lot of ways. The supply chains were hit, the manufacturing sector was hit hugely, and that still continues to be hit. A lot of the workforce is still not back in the factories, and we've still got supply chain issues, whether it's chips or it's the logistics sector. So there are challenges which still exist. That said, if we look at it from another perspective, how this market's really going to evolve. See, people are, during these last 2 years, there has been a lot of uncertainty in the market. What's really going to happen? How long is this going to continue? We don't know how long we're going to continue working from home. Are the offices going to open back up again? And et cetera, et cetera. So there's been a lot of challenges which have existed. Now, when we look at it, we are going to go either two ways. There's parts of Asia which have actually gone down a very rapid recovery route, where when we saw when China opened up, for example, there was there was a lot of pent up demand which came in. Whereas on the other hand, we've seen in parts of Europe where there's been a kind of a dip and then a stabilization which begins to happen. In automotive, what I believe, and more so in the automotive sector, is that going forward, we're not going to see the kind of growth that we were seeing earlier. Certainly, there's going to be pent-up demand, and that demand is going to bounce back up. But we're not going to see that. It's a very mature sector. What we're going to see is a gradual shift. It's not going to be extremely rapid shift, but we are going to see a gradual shift, which is going to go more towards green mobility, electric vehicles, etc. And that's where I think there's going to be substantial amount of, we're going to see a lot of hockey stick growth, as we call it, in the next couple of years coming in from there. That's going to be multifold more than what we've actually seen in the past. So I think there's going to be a shift rather than, in the same things working in the same traditional manner. When we look at, industries, when we look at consumer industries, while there's been a lot of industries have actually been hit negatively, there are also a number of industries which have flourished in the last 2 years. So while we look at hospitality, which had suffered, you look at homestays, which has actually increased. While we look at restaurant business and that sector which is getting hit, you've seen deliveries increasing substantially. You've seen e-commerce really flourishing, and you've also seen while the retail sector or while the rentals for office spaces have gone down or not been utilized that much, we've seen technology and all those technologies really come into play. And same is the case even with education. While the schools have shut down, we've seen a substantial demand in online education. So I think what's going to happen, what you're going to see from here on, is there's going to be a gradual shift which is going to go towards a different direction. And in automotive, I believe that the pushes that we are seeing, whether it's from the center, various policies, or we are seeing from various states, the push is going to be towards green mobility. Again, taking the dependence off oil and also making this and from an economic standpoint, it also makes sense. So when you look at this whole sector, I think there's going to be a transition which begins to happen towards green mobility now.
No, I take your point about transition to green mobility. I mean, that is inevitable now. But what I wanted to know from you, Mr. Munjal, is you said that this is a mature sector, and therefore we cannot have the kinds of two-wheeler growth that we had till 2000, maybe 17, 18. Do you think that something is needed from the government in terms of increasing the consuming class? I mean, what are we working with? About 250 million, 300 million as the consuming middle class. Do you think something is needed? Is that class itself come down because of COVID? People who have lost jobs permanently or employability permanently, and anything the government can do?
See, the government is doing a fair bit when you look at, from the manufacturing standpoint. So we've got these 13 PLIs which have been announced, which is close to about 2 lakh crores, which is the amount which has been allocated for these various PLIs. Now, while that is a very, very good move, what is also required is actually demand creation to kickstart that demand. And a part of that demand will get created as we see, the interest rates coming down. So that from that, we're going to see a lot of retail demand, which is going to spike up, which is going to come up. Plus, we're going to see house purchases, which are going to increase because of these interest rates coming down. If I come back to electric mobility for that matter, again, when we see the pricing at this point of time, when we see the commercials, the economics at this point of time, those are in favor of electric vehicles. The government is giving a substantial push. And that is more towards now the entry level. Earlier, the whole push was towards the premium end of the category. Now it's more towards entry level and to the commuter segment, which is going to help. So I think interest rates will help. A lot of these policies will have long-lasting effects, even exports for that matter. Now, exports is a sector which is doing well, but for us to really become a manufacturing hub for the world, it is going to require time. So it is even the PLI, it's going to have a number of years before we really begin to see the long-term effects. But in the longer term, these are all steps in the right direction. These are good steps.
Well, thank you very much for that. Actually, you've raised a number of issues which we'll hopefully be able to flesh out with Sanjeev as well. But before I toss it back to Sanjeev, let me get one more important angle. Charu Malhotra, I would consider you the most important person over here because I think the social sector has been hurt rather badly. And as an educationist, while a lot of investment is being done in health now, understandably, because that is such an urgent and emergent problem, education has actually got a very rough end of the stick. And I can tell you anecdotally and with data put out by Indian Express that the dropout in school levels at the lower level is serious. So can you just estimate to us the problem, whether we have increased some long-term scarring in the educational sector? Anything in terms of numbers, unemployability, or unskilling or de-skilling of youth?
Thank you. Yes, Lata. So one, of course, COVID amplifying problems, not just in education, but education-related problems in employment, as well as the economy. So I just want to backtrack a bit here and just refer, since this whole Sanjeev Samyar ji was talking about growth, pro-growth. But I think we are also faced with the prospects of jobless growth or increasing unemployment rates if we are not going to be looking at in an inclusive manner. So when we speak of skilling or when we speak of education, a couple of inclusion-related issues here. It could be financial inclusion. It could be, in terms of the gender lens. For example, women education doesn't prepare, and I'm generalizing here, but I'm talking for the larger majority over here. It doesn't prepare women for, jobs that pay higher. In terms of, or prepare them for the formal sector largely. So either education is preparing women or not preparing women to get into low-paid jobs or sectors or in the informal sector. So I think that's one area. And but I think the new education policy is looking at that, STEM education, skilling initiatives under the various ministries, under CSR. But I think these are also very short-term, problems. And especially for COVID, we should be looking at short-term and long-term. So if we are looking at reviving the demand, if we're looking at reviving the economy, even pre-COVID, 80% women were precluded from the labor force participation. And there was a survey somewhere which actually said that if the 80% women were to be brought into the labor force participation, India would be 27% richer. And that's the kind of opportunity cost we are looking at.
I agree with you on jobless growth because, that is a fear. In fact, actually, before I go to Sanjeev on this fear of jobless growth, let me get Preeta in as well, since, she's an important part which represents both solves both the social problem as well as the economic problem. So Preeta, what is your sense about the plans already afoot? I think the government has done very innovatively in terms of allowing the ECLGS scheme as well, allowing credit, and the RBI announcing that TLTRO, which makes it lucrative for bankers to lend to the medical sector. Do you think this can be both a stimulus and give us adequate protection from a possible third wave if it happens, Preeta?
So in terms of protection from the third wave, I don't think this is going to help, too much, because the third wave.
I should have said preparation for a third wave. Protection would be
preparation for sure. I would completely agree to that, because I think the government's policy on, helping the sector, helping us with investments in the tier 2 cities, where we saw this time that it was rural India, the tier 2 cities who were actually impacted hugely, which didn't happen in the first wave. So I think that from a policy decision, it's really good. But you must forgive me, I have to ask for more. I think the industry as such, the private sector, has been hurt tremendously, because on one side, the service for the COVID stricken was done, and it was done not because it was a good business to be in, but because it just had to be done. There was no question about it. Having said that, there has been reluctance from people to come in for the other parts of it, and even if they did, there were no beds available. So it was, almost like a catch-22 situation. Now the industry has to recoup, and for it to get back on a kind of footing which, makes it First, it is service oriented. There's no question of that. But we need to reinvest into the industry for it to recoup, because we realized that the infrastructure was completely inadequate. And to do that, I think support is required. And if the right amount of support, I'm not even asking for a blank check, it's not required. But if the right amount of support really came in for not even forever, but for, let's say, for 5 years, for the next cycle, the industry should be able to contribute to GDP. And I'm strongly professing that, because there's data which says 16% of our GDP comes from agriculture, 14% from manufacturing, and 49% from services. So I think if 49% is coming from services and there is actually revenue to come in for businesses to flourish, then we should really support the service sector. And multiple, there was tourism, there is healthcare, there is education in a way. So there's so many aspects of service sector which I think will then help us to reboot and get the economy more vibrant.
Well, I'll come to the banker in just a minute, because I have a tendency to ask too many questions to bankers. So just hold on, Kaushik, I'm coming to you in a minute. I want to ask Sanjeev Samyar a couple of the questions that have already been tossed, or at least issues which have been raised by the panelists. First up, the PLI. Sanjeev, you also referred to it. And both Naveen Munjal and Preetha have referred to PLI. What is the employment intensity of, employment elasticity of PLI? Any numbers at all? I mean, it's a great scheme, but what does it deliver in terms of jobs? As Charu said, jobless growth is a serious concern. And I have some numbers which I could pull out. This is something which Citibank put out in one of their employment reports. It's a mix of the periodic labor force survey of the NSO plus some CMI data. They are pointing out, the Citi report points out that total of employed people in India has been falling since FY18. FY18, it is about 406 million people. In FY19, which is really pre-COVID, it's fallen to 401, rises to 404 in FY20, and 21, of course, because of COVID, it's fallen to 379 and then 383. So there is a secular fall in employment, or at least jobless growth, because both these were growth years. So what is the pointed question? Sorry, what is the employment intensity of PLI? Sanjeev, that was to you.
I had been muted for I dropped out at some point and then got muted, sorry. See, first of all, I think before we get into this debate of jobless growth, a very simple point, we need to have growth first. Whether the amount of jobs we create is more or less than what we would like it to be is something we shouldn't get too concerned about, when the issue is that we have significant proportion of the economy under lockdown. We're now opening it up. So we focus on getting momentum going, then we can talk about whether it's trickling down to job creation. Because if you don't have growth, then this debate does not even start. So I think very often this debate goes into a very premature discussion about whether or not jobless growth happens or not, and so on. If you don't have growth, the debate is not even meaningful. So I think the first thing we need to focus on is to get growth going. And the experience is that second and third order impacts of that growth are generally positive for jobs. Now, maybe there are certain strategies we can use that can increase job creation, but they typically are not demand measures. They tend to be supply side measures. And in that context, you will have seen, we have done in very recent past, a whole bunch of reforms, including reforming labor laws, for example. That was an important part of that. Even in the PLI scheme, we have done something very different from our historical approach, which is we had this rather tilted approach, which was biased against scaling up. And so the PLI scheme is deliberately set up to encourage scaling up, so that the growth is sort of growth drives further growth and consequently leads to clustering and then jobs. So there is
Uh, I mean, if I'm right, I think the line is frozen. We are not able to hear Sanjeev. Is that what everybody else is also going through? Not able to hear Sanjeev?
Yes, Lata.
Yeah. I think so we'll have to reconnect with Sanjeev, and we should be doing that very soon. Maybe he'll just have to re-log in if someone can just phone him. In the meanwhile, let me get the banker in. Kaushik, what's your estimate? The RBI has done very well in terms of pushing a lot of liquidity in and keeping rates low. And as we heard from Naveen, Mr. Naveen Munjal, he sees that as a very good reason why more houses will be hopefully sold when things clear up. More two-wheelers will hopefully be bought on EMIs once restrictions are removed. But you tell me, do you think that we are now at the end of the tether, going by the inflation numbers both globally and in India? Do you think that we will have to start removing this policy sometime soon?
So I think it's a good question. When we talk about interest rates, I think we should probably look at it more in terms of what we want to do now to support growth and what we need to do to ensure a long-term proper growth taking place, which actually percolates down to people. And so you need to manage inflation at some stage. So I think it's more a question of timing rather than direction. And I think that's where I think Sanjeev's answer resonates a lot with me. Depends on which problem you want to solve first. You need to tweak yourself along with that. So I think the government and RBI will have to come to a similar understanding as to what problem which we need to solve immediately and what is a medium to longer term trend to which we need to align ourselves. So I would probably, to this add a couple of points, if I may, Lata. I think we spoke a lot about demand. We spoke a lot about fiscal stuff to be done. And I do believe that I think the way we have kept our fiscal deficit reasonably under control while still announcing a larger amount of relief measures is commendable. But I think there are two things which we probably can seek from the government more. I think Churchill said this very well: never let a good crisis go waste. And I think the crisis is still there. We still have some time to do that. We can still come with, not every time do we need things to be done from the fiscal perspective or announcement of some SOPs or subsidies, but we need some policy changes too. I think if you want to push for growth, one is to put money into hands of people, and second is to stoke long-term demand by actually increasing supply side, which is what the government is doing as of now. So how do we ensure that the intensity and the intent, which nobody is questioning of the government, how can we support on the execution so that we get to some of these things faster and whatever is announced does get done? I mean, if I just cite the whole unshackling of unproductive assets which we have because of stuck up of the NCLT courts for 6-9 months, is a tremendous waste. If those were unshackled, how many more people could have got employed? If I look at it in terms of the fact that we've been debating for a long time that should we open up to outsiders or not? Will outsiders, if we borrow from them, will they own us? And that whole fear psychosis we had. This was a brilliant time for us to come out of it and come out probably with a index-linked bond or a bond. So we probably have a lot of opportunities now to use this crisis to the advantage and not worry about some of those managing stakeholders who slow us down at times. And the fact that we are a democracy, we cannot let go of a crisis.
Okay. I'm assuming you're speaking about the sovereign bond. Well, that issue has been stymied for now. So I don't know whether that'll be back on the table. Will it be, Sanjeev?
Well, I think the sovereign bond issue, as we said, what do we need that resource for? If it's about capital flows, then I think the point has been made while we have considered it. I don't think the problem is with us wanting dollars, because in the sense that, our reserves have gone up to levels where, in fact, it may cause us problems with the US authorities. So our real issue is about capital flows into our system. And in that context, I think the path we have gone for is to open up our bond markets further to foreign investment, and to try and get ourselves listed on global bond indices, on which we are taking step by step. A lot of minor niggling problems are getting ironed out. Most of it is done, but the Euro Clear and other things are getting sorted. So that is the path we have gone for, rather than to go for a sovereign bond in dollars or whatever. That's, may have been at some point in history the correct path, but as things stand, it is not what we don't think we need that. We much rather become an open market, allow flows to go back and forth.
Okay. Sanjeev, we were speaking about jobless growth. Let's not get into the jobless growth debate, as you said, but PLI itself, is there any number that the government has in terms of its employment elasticity, its ability to create jobs? And in that context, how quickly can we think of getting the supposedly employment-intensive PLI sectors, for instance, textiles? When can we expect that?
So obviously that I'm not in a position to announce actual policies, but we do recognize that certain kinds of PLIs will have more income elasticity. Having said that, very often these are difficult ones, because, for example, if there is a sector which in the first order requires a lot, is very capital intensive and machinery intensive, but the fact of the matter is the building of the machinery, the building of the buildings, etc., may be generating a lot of jobs. So sometimes don't just look at the first order impact of a sector to think about the job creation aspect of it. Secondly, the PLI scheme is all about growth. And you're right, there are certain more sectors that we may consider to put into it. I think the initial, remember, this is also an experiment that we have just done, a very big break from our past approach to participating in supply chains. But it seems to have succeeded in some sectors, like electronics type sector seems to have already got us a lot of FDI. So if it is doing well, and it seems like this is the approach we need to take, then certainly we will look to extend it to other sectors if it's being so well accepted and successful. But as I said, it's not for me to tell you which sector and how, because it's the prerogative of the relevant minister to announce such things. I don't think you're muted.
Okay, if it was, if you had a number in terms of how many jobs you all thought this 2 lakh crore can create.
So no, I think that is the wrong way to think about it, because the PLI scheme is, the nature of it is that the idea is to build a certain cluster. Once a certain cluster builds up, so we try, say, 10 sectors, it's not like we expect all the 10 sectors to succeed.
Okay.
Right? We expect some of them to succeed, and they will succeed. But the game is here that, let's say, 5 of those sectors succeed. But the game is here that those guys get enough clustering that they become globally competitive and explode out. Now, now it's very difficult to predict which of those sectors will be those sectors, what the impact will be. Anybody who's getting into the game is trying to predict based on the PLI scheme hasn't understood basics of what we are trying to do. It's about increasing returns to scale. And those increasing returns to scale will happen in a few sectors, but I have no way of knowing which of them.
Fair enough. Fair enough. There's just one more sector I want to discuss with you and then go back to the other panelists. You spoke about exports doing well. Actually, it's doing fabulously well. Let me just look up June exports, for instance. Exports in June at $32.5 billion were 30% above June 2019. I'm not even going to June 20. As a rule, these days, I don't compare with the last year because it doesn't really give you much of a story. But compared to 2019, if we are 30% higher, this is something like a 15% CAGR of exports. Now, is the government planning or wanting to do something that might push this good thing along? An export-led growth looks, very much part. So
obviously,
just to finish, MEIS was removed and one was expecting ROTEP in its place. That also hasn't come, or it's taking its time. So anything the government is.
So I didn't catch the very end of what you said, but I think the question is quite clear. Obviously, we are happy that exports have taken up. Some part of it is just that the rest of the world has expended enormous energy to expand back demand. So it's a one-time benefit. We are taking advantage of it, but it's a one-time benefit. But there are somewhat, hopefully, longer-term things. One is the rejigging of supply chains globally that is happening because of a variety of reasons, including geopolitical reasons. For a long time, people argued that India was unable to take advantage of it. I think it should be quite clear that we are able to take advantage of this in some sectors. And of course, the PLI scheme itself has been a part of that, creating the cluster. But I think in the end, what really matters is that we now take advantage of getting rid of the minor regulatory irritants in our exports. So other than, I think, a few areas like maybe direct taxes, etc., where big reforms need to be done, I would argue most of the really big reforms have either been done or have they been announced. I mean, privatization may be a big reform. We may not have done it, but it's been announced. GST is more or less done. You can improve on it, but the big reform is done. Insolvency and bankruptcy code is basically done. Labor reforms, you can still tinker, but basically announced and most of it done. So what we really now need to do is to get into the real nitty-gritty reforms, sector by sector. And I'll give you some examples of many of these that we have done, which very often may not capture the headlines, but we are doing them continuously. For example, a big sector in India is the BPO sector. Yeah. For last 20 years, completely absurd telecom regulations were placed on it. We got rid of some of them in November, and now we have completely gotten rid of them in just 3 weeks ago. So now basically the telecom regulator and the telecom regulators have virtually no say in IT BPO sector, right? Same thing we have done with, by the way, the mapping and cartography and geospatial data sector. It used to be basically a monopoly of the Survey of India. We've opened it up. Now it's just an completely open sector. Drone policy. We introduced a drone policy, but we are looking towards radically changing even that, because we can see that new changes are happening. We need to open things up. So point I'm making to you is, I think the real business of reforms from here on is not simply to, the grand waving of the wand for big reforms. There may be some left, but the real thing is make sure our ports are, top notch and able to compete with the best in the world. That doesn't need big reforms. It needs sitting there, making sure the processes step by step, rule number XYZ has to be changed. Make sure that this bit goes there. Painful, boring stuff, but it has to be done. And much of the benefits we will get from here on will come from sorting those out.
No, actually, BPO may surprise us very, very positively in terms of both jobs and income, or so it seems from what we hear from guests who come on the channel. Preetha Reddy, I wanted to ask you about exactly these nitty-gritty things that Sanjeev Samyar is speaking about. There was this program announced by the finance minister just recently about creating hospitals in other than metro cities, and the government assuring backing 75%, guaranteeing 75% of the credit. Do you think a large network of hospitals can come up with the combination of both cheap credit and guaranteed credit?
So Lata, I think the problem is not building the infrastructure, which I think we're very grateful to the government for announcing and doing it. You can build a good, low-cost functional hospital. You can manage with equipment because somewhere or the other you'll get funding for it. To me, the biggest problem here is in the skilling aspect. And I think unless we're able to skill for the future, we're not going to be able to do as much, while it's almost like saying that you put something in front of them, but you can't really cook that goose at all unless you have enough manpower to man these hospitals and infrastructure. And for that, there is a certain amount of policy change, but it's not enough, and it's not quick, and it's not fast. And to me, we are putting the cart before the horse, and we need to first be able to skill, because if we decide today, it's going to take 5 years minimum. And that is the key, according to me.
What exactly would you want? How can the government encourage more skilled nurses and doctors?
So, we're still living with a lot of archaic rules, which was a British legacy. Whether it's training doctors, skilling nurses, we still talk about this, the size of infrastructure, which in today's digital world you actually don't need. And then there's so many rules and regulations. It's regulated, saying that you can do with an investment on huge infrastructure only 150 nurses or doctors. We should do 500. We should do like 1,000. And and this many beds are required, but why not open up the public hospitals also for training, work together? And I think a lot of thinking, forward thinking, thinking out of the box, using digital for medical education still is not an accepted policy. It is, by the way, it's good to have, but it's not really something which is mandated or something which is accepted. And we're still very dependent on physical versus digital. And to me, that needs to change, because otherwise we'll never meet that requirement.
Sorry, that takes the question straight away to Charu. Charu, Preetha is also talking about the lack of skilled, unemployment is not the problem. Employability seems to be the problem. Charu, take it away. What would you want?
So yes, and there is those many jobs that will get created, but I think what the other side of the coin would be enterprise, and where skilling is much needed, especially. And we are here on the flow, the platform here, where Flow has done a lot of work in mentoring women-owned businesses. Especially in the pandemic, these have faced the most, demand shocks, and those also the small businesses, the micro enterprises. So if 20% businesses are owned by women, around 90% of them are micro enterprises. And they need not just skilling, they need lots more support. They need finance, they need capital, they need market linkages. You spoke of CSR. So can even the CSR legislation be tweaked to, or maybe if it already can absorb, how about even women suppliers getting linked to, corporate value chains? And so can that happen under CSR as one thing? So yes, we agree, you have to power growth, but we have to do it in a manner where we do not, end up with a concentration of wealth. And speaking of which sectors, so women work largely, which have actually faced the shock during COVID, in consumer-facing sectors like food processing, even in agriculture, as well as textiles and handicrafts. Now, these are some sectors which have so whether it is fund of funds, investors, government scheme, even governments through some of their schemes. So can we actually look at where, and there is sexism in terms of, and there are biases when it comes to investing in women-owned small enterprises, because they lack the wherewithal. They do not have business plans. They do not have credit history. So they lack definitely the skills of even, financial literacy, finance management, a lot of those things. How do you even manage working capital? What is the concept of working capital? So I think skills, I think that's very, very prudent. They definitely need skilling. And Flow has, Mandeshi Foundation, which has put up these rural business schools. And they've supported around 90,000 women, or a lakh or maybe more of women through their, whether it's community radios, whether it is women helplines, or even the capital. So I think it's not just funding, but also its skilling and awareness of schemes. So I think 11% or 15% of women are aware of those schemes. One is awareness. So I think we need to ramp up our campaign in terms of what is there for women to avail of, and also some hand holding where we can pump up or push up instances of women availing of these schemes.
Well, one hopes the new Ministry of Cooperatives will be able to, handhold. In a bit, I'll be coming around asking for your short list of asks from the government, and perhaps you can, crystallize your exact asks. Both Preeta and you have put some extremely concrete points on the table in terms of, where, while current policy goes this far, it doesn't go the whole hog. Mr. Munjal, to you, both on exports, where again this raw tip seems to be a bit of a niggling worry, although exports have done very well, and in terms of PLI, where auto ancillaries is a very important sector, any asks?
So on the PLI, now let's look at both these sectors. PLI is a very, very important sector, especially for us, when we are coming from electric mobility, and that seems to be a government's huge push that we've got. So we've got substantial tailwinds propelling us forward. However, there are certain changes which are required in the PLIs, for example. At this point, the PLI, when it comes to mobility, is more for new entrants. But what about the old entrants who are actually introducing or who are investing into this sector? So there needs to be a level of levelization which actually comes in. The second factor, which is a very important factor, is while exports are very, very important, again, when it comes to electric mobility, rather than the automotive has been there for decades now. So that's well established. This sector is still new, but this sector can play a very, very important role when it comes to the international markets, and where India can have a very substantial role in that. However, that said, the supply chain in India is still not robust enough. And so a large part of it, we still rely on imports in order to actually, service even the domestic markets. To give you an example, battery manufacturing, though there is a PLI for ACC batteries, which is in place. However, there's a while before that really kicks in. And that is only going to kick in once there's enough volume in the market in order to justify those investments. So when we are looking at imports, for example, for batteries, which are not manufactured in India, what's happening on year, the import duties are increasing. So as to the idea behind that is to get into local manufacturing. But what actually happens with a concept like that is the minute you increase the duties, your resale, your value, your product becomes more expensive to the customer, in which case it kind of reduces the volumes. So I think that balancing effect needs to be done. While I'm totally for local manufacturing, I'm totally for localization, that needs to be done in a milestone manner. You get to a certain level and then the supply chains begin to fall into place. So international markets, exports, India can play a very important role, but we need to do it in a manner where we have long-term policies. At this point, when we look at even policies, there's no long-term policy to conversion to electric mobility, for example. That's something that also needs to be put in place. We need to have certain goals and targets in place to say that, in the next 7 years or 8 years or 10 years, whatever be the case, we need to convert to that extent, and then do a backward calculation from there on what is required today in order to achieve those numbers at that point of time. Without that, we will still get to a certain level, but it may not be to the extent that what we are looking at.
All the points are noted, I'm sure, and that's some concrete list that you have put on the table. Kaushik, to come back to you, actually this past year, India Inc. has lightened its debt, lightened its balance sheet. In fact, it's skipping into FY22 with much less demand and therefore much more space for capex. Do you see this capex happening? The way credit growth has panned out at between 5 and 6%, that doesn't seem to be. So your thoughts on, whether you see it coming shortly, any pent up growth in capex cycle, and any asks to stimulate it?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think brownfield projects and greenfield projects in a COVID time will be difficult. And that's why I was going back to opening up the supply through what we already have and making it productive. So I think so we really need to, and I think as rightfully said, is that the government has made a lot of announcements, but I think it's more about checking whether those announcements are getting turned into action and execution? And is there any benefit coming to the country because of that? We have IBC code now for a while, but how successful have we been in making use of it? So how do we streamline those processes? And right now, I think the need is, and the corporate India would be actually quite keen to see how it can leverage some of those assets and put them to use well. But we need to cut through the red tape and the legal process. So I know not everything is a policy issue. Sometimes I think the government also has to work with judiciary. But finally, I think they need to work together to find a solution to that. And if we spend more time on those issues, or be it in terms of how we can't get all of the stuff which is stuck right now, just solved through the local capital itself. We'll have some local risk ability, but you may not have funding in some cases. So you need to also stimulate offshore demand for distressed assets, for example. How do you get that into secondary trading? How do you ensure that we don't keep our budget deficit in control? Then you need to monetize your future receivables of the government. How do you make those things happen? I think those are the key areas, I think, which we can look at, which are quick wins in a way. But like Sanjeev said, are detailed issues and not big policy issues, but it is more about getting whatever is announced actually implemented, right?
I can see, Kaushik, that you're quite disappointed with the way IBC has panned out and its long holiday because of COVID. I share that disappointment because as a person covering banking, a lot was expected from IBC. But be that as it may, yes, some low-hanging fruits in terms of perhaps ease of doing certain things will certainly help. Especially having foreign funds by.
And the other thing is on the privatization. Sorry if I may miss that out. We have announced a lot of on privatization. Now we really need to execute that. I think year after year we see fair amount of announcement on that. And I can again, this relates to your point on corporate India having light balance sheets now. They will take advantage of this if we really get this process out quickly. I mean, take for example the steel sector, right? We have a few announcements on what is going to get divested. Can we ensure that it actually happens in the course of the next 6 months, right? So it's more execution issue rather than policy issue, right?
Well, Sanjeev, you want to respond to that privatization?
I mean, obviously, this is one government that is unapologetic about the fact that we need to privatize non-strategic assets. So yes, there have been many delays, partly because of the COVID situation. But I would argue that the markets are quite supportive now. And now that we are back on stream, we've done a lot of background work, as you already know. So it's a matter of getting on there and doing it. But it's not a policy issue. It's something where the proof of the pudding is in the eating. And as Kaushik said, we need to make sure that the small bits that need to be done to get the things we have announced actually deliver, that needs to be done. And we, as you see, I gave you some examples earlier where we've identified the problem and we have gone and solved it. So that is basically, I would argue, the focus, make the pipelines or whatever it is function. The pipelines have been laid of various things and they were difficult. There was a political opposition. There still is political opposition to some of our measures on farm sector and so on. But I think the idea is to get the pipeline in place. It's been put in place. Now to pump things through the pipeline, there will be blockages along the way. Those blockages need to be cleaned up.
No, very clearly, not even metaphorically, very practically, the way in which the government has gone about in gas policy clearly indicates that, the pipelines have been laid in other areas as well for future benefits to be reaped. Sanjeev, very quickly, another point from you, and then I'm going to get a list of asks from the others, concrete list to submit to you. The GST collections in June may have been bad, and that is understandable because May was one of the months which we would all like to forget. There was hardly any activity. But otherwise, GST is systematically generated, more and more in terms of taxes. And I am not sure that is only because of economic recovery. It looks like we are collecting better. And likewise, even in personal income tax, if I was looking at the last 5-year data, and while we were growing at maybe about 6-8%, in the last 2-3 years, we have actually grown by double digits in terms of personal income tax. Is the government getting something right in terms of interfacing CBDT, CBIC data? Are we on a trajectory for higher tax to GDP once this ugly period is over?
So I think the key thing as far as the GST is concerned, that we have put in place a system which I think may not be perfect, but it's a radical improvement on whatever used to exist before. I think even those who complain about GST will agree that it's an improvement on the pre-GST system, and many niggling problems have been sorted along the way. So now we have a system that is buoyant. It's if you get growth, you will get revenue. So it is not a system that's now. We can, of course, simplify it and reduce the number of slabs or whatever. You can improve on it, but I would argue that, my grandchildren will use some version of this GST system. The same thing is true of the IBC. I think we can, again, you need more judges, or this process needs to be cleaned up, whatever it may be. But the IBC framework is broadly the one that will exist even 2 generations from now. So I think those are very painful things that we put in place. And so while there may be some areas, I think direct taxes is one area where, again, radical change may be needed. But other than that, I think very major structural changes have got done, and they are done. Now it's a matter of tweaking it to make it work better. So I think that is something that we have already done. Same thing, by the way, even with the banking sector. There used to be all kinds of problems, large parts of the banking system, cooperative banks, which were not even regulated by the central bank. There were lots of problems with the NBFCs. Now, when you begin to impose control of all those bits and pieces, there will be problems, because for the first time, you're going to go and open up their books. So there will be a disruption in the system. Similarly, we have now introduced the bilateral netting. Kaushik, you will remember this because we discussed this many, many years ago before I was in the government. And it's there. All the notifications relating to it, I have personally vetted, and we have put it out there. So bilateral netting is a reality in India. Consequently, we can now create a corporate default swap market and all the other things that come with it. So point I'm making is a lot of the architecture has already been put in place. Now it's a matter of making it work. And that's why I differentiated with the kinds of reforms we need to do. The really big, painful, disruptive reforms have actually got done. People have complained about it, whether it is inflation targeting, whether it's the cleanup of the banks, the imposing of some order, all of that are actually done. Even the direct tax one is not a painful one, because that is one reform which actually is expansionary, not deflationary. But what we have done, the point you were making earlier, is we have put in place the structure. And as those structures are finally falling into place, we are finding that they are buoyant to growth. And that's why I wanted to make the point earlier, is that we spend too much time debating about whether growth will do all the promised things. Well, actually, let's growth happen. And it does take care of a lot of things. Now, if growth is happening and we are generating all the revenue, then, if there are areas where jobs are not created, we have the resources to target those areas and help them out. But because we get into this thing, if there is growth happens and still doesn't help, well, we'll deal with those things, because when growth happens, it does solve some problems. One of them is, by the way, government revenues, because then it gives us resources to target those sectors and do stuff. So I think the painful things have got done. We now need to pump growth and get on with it.
Well, I'll definitely let you have the last word, but now from the guests, what is your key 1, 2, 3 asks? Even if you're 1 or 2 and not 3, that I'm sure Sanjeev will be very happy about it. But let me start with you, Charu.
We need to democratize opportunities, especially for women-run businesses. And we need to do that by government, not just, so there is interest subvention and we have, credit guarantee schemes, but we need, so apart from debt capital, women need equity capital as well, right? And the second point is that the government, and nothing like government support to promote products from women-run businesses with tax incentives. and probably bring them under a common brand, because that would help clustering. Yeah.
Well, that's eloquently put and easy to understand. Preeta?
So mine are simple and immediate asks because, I think this sector could do with this shot in the arm. 70% of the country's medical needs are actually in the private sector, and we have to be cognizant of that. So the sector is really asking for zero rating GST on output services for the next 2 years only, and that cost can be set off by hospitals, and thereafter moving to a 5% regime. And this is completely from the sector, and I think it's critical. The second thing is that if we really want to expand and if we want to create jobs and build more infrastructure, we know that land costs on a hospital balance sheet is huge. It's heavy. And globally, everybody is looking at REITs. They're looking at asset-light models. Cost of capital is, again, a bit expensive in our country. So can we really have, the zero GST on leasing of land, have a separate PropCo and property company and the really OpCo, which is happening all over the world. So can we be a little bit more contemporary? Because then it provides jobs, it provides less expensive healthcare. So there are multiple things which happen. The third thing is that, innovative incentives for training. I've been saying it and time again that we really need more manpower. So for the specialist manpower, which are being, trained in the hospitals, can we have some kind of a subsidy to meet their allowances, their salaries, so that then we can churn out large numbers of specialists who then can go into the smaller towns, serve. So, I think we need to start thinking a bit differently. But to me, these are the three asks. They're immediate, they're required, and then the sector will really flourish.
Can't complain at all. Zero rating GST for some services and zero GST on land leasing. I think that's come repeatedly from some sectors, especially like yours, specialist manpower, skilling. Take your point. Mr. Naveen Munjal?
So I already mentioned a couple of them earlier. I'll just kind of repeat them. I'll just make them concise. So one of them, of course, is we need to have long-term policies. And that's something I guess, will fall into place over a period of time. The second factor is about the PLI that we've got. And that relates more to new companies rather than the ones which are already expanding. So there should be no distinction between the two. Whoever's making an investment, whether it's an old company or a new one. And I'm talking more about the electric mobility sector here. The other factor is, while there has been changes which have been done. So we had the FAME policy, which came into play in 2019. And that, to start with, wasn't a very successful policy, but there have been amendments which have been done in the last number of weeks, which make it a very good policy now. While that has happened, we've made the policy better. But on the other hand, we've also increased the import duties on things like batteries, which are still not manufactured here. So it's literally, in a way, it's taking from one and giving it to another hand. So that's something that we would want you to this is a sector which needs a bit of hand-holding for the next couple of years to get it up to a certain level. The import duties, etc., should be milestone-based. So get it up to a certain number, start importing import duties. Get it up to another number, and then start tapering down the policies and start tapering down the subsidies, etc. Financing is still a big challenge, even though we have numerous relationships with public sector banks and private banks and NBFCs. However, financing in this sector is still a challenge which needs a bit of addressal. And another factor, which is a very important factor, which is non-physical, is when we talk about such programs like Swachh Bharat, we talk about pollution outside. Let's talk about air pollution as well. And if you're talking about air pollution, then let's talk about conversion to electric mobility. That would cause awareness. That's not going to cost the government anything, but that's going to cause awareness, which will result in a catapulting effect.
So a faster announcement and implementation of a policy of conversion to electric vehicles. I mean, that would be the main ask. Kaushik Shaparia?
I'll just repeat some of my points. I think it's more about execution. And like Sanjeev rightly said, the government has announced a lot of policies, more about now getting them going. And how do we get that whole manufacturing, which we want in India? When we talk to multinationals who want to manufacture, we have land, labor, and legal system reforms we talk about, but do they experience it? So how do we ensure that that happens. So that would be a very a small point, but get probably the biggest point. I would come back to the sovereign bond one more time, and the point is not that India has got 600 billion reserves and it's enough. We need a benchmark for Indian corporates and FIs when they go out in the international market to benchmark against. We are such a large country, we still don't have a benchmark. It is more to create a benchmark rather than it being of need for the government or for a reserve. So I think 10 billion for a 600 billion reserve is peanuts. But you need a small issuance coming in, which will allow us to get into global indexes. And then we will have lots of money flows coming in, which is what in any case we want to promote. It's not that money which we are looking for, but it will create the environment for fresh money to come in. And which is a point I think we keep on making to the government. I think some of them get it, but I think it's more about the advocacy to the naysayers, right?
Okay. Nice try, Kaushik, but I think it'll have to be done first in Mumbai at Mint Street. Sanjeev, I just wanted to ask you, what was your own anticipation? When you started, you said we have yet to check out whether verticals like retail, hospitality, travel need help, or should it be, horizontal help? What is your best sense? And how much fiscal space is there at all?
So first of all, I think there is willingness and some fiscal space, or if, as I said, depending on the circumstance, if it happens to be that growth is good overall and you need to help certain sectors, then obviously there is more fiscal space because the rest of the economy is generating revenue in order, and we discussed that GST is actually quite a buoyant form of revenue gathering. Then we have resources then to channel to targeted sectors. That's why I kept coming back to the point, you need to have growth going. Because if you have growth going, then our tax system is able, we have demonstrated, to generate the resources to target things. But if we get into this rather negative debate, if there is growth, will it be jobless growth and that kind of debate, then we will tie ourselves into knots. So I think the first and most important thing is get growth going. We are seeing growth coming from certain kinds of sectors like exports, which is clearly generating very rapid growth. There are certain kinds of services sectors that are doing well. And who knows, if we do the lockdown and we don't get a third wave, then many of the sectors we currently think are problem sectors, like say travel, tourism, etc., may actually resolve themselves with a little bit of help maybe, but basically get sorted out. Then we may have other sectors that require help, which we hadn't thought of. So that's why I keep saying, do not get swayed by what your preconceptions are, what will be the problem area. One of the things we have surely learned from the last 18 months of going through this COVID crisis is that never mind what the experts and models say. Look at what actually happens and respond firmly and quickly to what actually happens.
Okay. Sanjeev, before I, thank you on this, FICCI Flow, that is the FICCI Ladies Organization, has also gathered a lot of, asks from their members. And I think they are better in the know of what industry wants. So Ujjwala Singhania, have your say. What is your shortlist or FICCI Flow's shortlist of expectations?
Thank you. My ask is more focused on women-owned businesses. Just to mention few, all policy framework should incorporate short-term as well as medium and long-term measures, mitigating funds and cash constraint by clearing MSME dues and incentives as soon as possible. I would also suggest extension of moratorium on loans, subvention and restructure NPAs, a more proactive, flexible and women-friendly role by SIDBI, and also to bring in a new policy of social security for MSME employees and migrant laborers. And lastly, amendment of IB code for women businesses.
Okay. Well, I guess some of it at least is the Reserve Bank's area in terms of moratorium and stuff like that. But I guess the boys will be reached sooner or later. Sanjeev Samyar, just a final word from you. Do you think we will reach the divestment target? That's the bigger fear. More than tax, because direct tax is not doing too badly. Corporates have done very well in the first quarter, at least better than expected in terms of the of Q1 expectations. And GST, barring a one-off month, is doing well. It's more than tax, it's non-tax that everyone in the street is worried about. Do you think divestment will really, fire? That is the question the panel is also asking you.
Well, I mean, clearly we are unapologetically in favor of doing privatization of non-strategic assets. That has been presented by the finance minister. A lot of work has gone into this. It's true we got thrown off a little bit because of key personnel working on it were themselves down with COVID. So that caused some delays. But let me say a lot of work has gone into this issue. So from here on, the problem is not one of design or theory or willingness. It's an implementation issue. And, there is a willingness to go out there and do it.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Sanjeev Samyar, for joining us in this discussion. Thank you, panelists, for putting some very terse points on the table. And let's hope that, much of what you are asking is not very significant in terms of perhaps GST on land lease, or in terms of trying to get equity capital to women entrepreneurs. We have much hope in the Ministry of Cooperation being able to do a lot of this, community development kind of issues. So maybe when we meet next time, many of these will already be ticked. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us.
Jyotsna, you're on mute. Please unmute yourself.
Yeah. Good evening, everyone, again. What a wonderfully insightful session with each speaker sharing valuable inputs and suggestions. With all of what was said, let us continue to be positive in our approach. On behalf of Flow, I would like to thank our guest speakers, Ms. Preetha Reddy, Mr. Naveen Munjal, Mr. Sanjeev Samyar, Mr. Kaushik Shapuria, Ms. Charu Malhotra for their time and excellent suggestions. Thank you, Lata, for taking the responsibility and moderating it so seamlessly. The value that each of you have brought today is huge. I also wish to thank FICCI and Flow Secretariat teams for all the support, and of course also all the speakers with their respective staff who have been coordinating with us. Most importantly, I would like to thank our dear Flow members who always stood by us. I'd like to acknowledge the outstanding support of our sponsor, Mr. Ravinder Agarwal of Duke Biscuits. Thank you everyone for joining today's session. We hope to have your continued support. Namaste, till we meet again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for this remarkable session.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.